Hey guys, tonight we begin with a deep dive into something truly chilling. No, not a ghost story, though it might feel like one by the time we're done. Tonight we're going to dim the gas lamps of our minds and settle in for a long, slow drift through the truly brutal, utterly miserable, and surprisingly stinky winters of Victorian-era London. So grab your warmest blanket, a mug of something steamy, and maybe a few extra cough drops, because this is going to be a long one. Let's just gently float back in time, shall we? Now, when we think of Victorian London, our minds often conjure up images of foggy streets, perhaps a hansom cab clattering by, and certainly a certain Dickensian charm, right? Maybe some carol singers, a bit of festive cheer. Well, let's just gently peel back that romanticized veneer, because the reality of a London winter in, say, 1850 was less about heartwarming chestnuts and more about lung-searing smog and the pervasive icy grip of disease. It was, to put it mildly, not a good time to be poor, or really even just a little bit rich if you valued fresh air and not dying prematurely. The very air itself was a weapon. London, even without the added chill of winter, was a city powered by coal. Thousands upon thousands of homes, factories, and businesses burned coal, day in and day out. And in winter, that consumption, of course, absolutely skyrocketed. Imagine every single chimney in a city of millions, all belching out thick, sooty smoke, mixing with the natural fog that rolled in from the Thames. This delightful concoction wasn't just a picturesque atmospheric effect. It was the infamous London particular, a pea super fog so dense you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. These fogs could last for days, even weeks, turning daylight into a perpetual twilight and the air into a suffocating, gritty soup. The effects of this smog were predictably devastating. Respiratory illnesses, already a major killer, went into overdrive during these winter months. Bronchitis, pneumonia, and a particularly nasty form of consumption, or tuberculosis, thrived in this environment. The very act of breathing became a hazard. People would cough constantly, their lungs filling with soot and grime. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep when every breath is a struggle and the air smells vaguely of damp coal and industrial exhaust. Not exactly conducive to a restful evening, is it? And it wasn't just the lungs that suffered. The lack of sunlight, combined with the general dreariness and cold, took a heavy toll on mental health. Seasonal affective disorder? Oh, it was most certainly a thing, just without the fancy name. The endless gray, the pervasive damp, the constant battle against the cold, it was enough to drive even the most cheerful Victorian to despair. And of course, the general diet of the poorer classes, already meager, became even more so in winter, further weakening their resistance to illness. Now let's talk about the cold itself. Central heating, as we know it, was still very much a futuristic concept. Most homes, even those of the well-to-do, relied on fireplaces. Grand, roaring fires, yes, but only really effective in the immediate vicinity of the hearth. Step a few feet away and you were back to shivering. Bedrooms, especially, were often frigid, unheated spaces. Imagine climbing into a cold bed in a cold room with only a thin nightshirt and perhaps a few heavy blankets for warmth. The wealthy might have had warming pans, metal pans filled with hot coals, passed over the sheets to take the chill off, but that was a luxury. For most, it was just cold, bone-chilling, persistent cold that seeped into everything. The pipes, of course, would freeze. Bursting pipes were a regular occurrence, leading to all sorts of messy domestic disasters, and getting water in general was a struggle. For the vast majority of Londoners, particularly the working classes, water came from communal pumps or shared standpipes. In freezing temperatures, these would often freeze solid, meaning a desperate hunt for any available water source. Imagine the struggle of simply trying to cook or clean when your water supply is frozen solid and you're battling a chest cough in a perpetually dim, frigid tenement. Not ideal for that relaxing bath you might be craving after a long day, I suppose. And speaking of water, or the lack thereof, let's just gently pivot to sanitation, or rather the utterly appalling lack of it. The Thames, the very artery of London, was, to put it mildly, an open sewer. Everything went into the Thames. Human waste, animal waste, industrial effluent, dead animals, you name it. In summer, this created the infamous Great Stink of 1858, which was so potent that Parliament literally had to suspend sittings because the smell was unbearable. But in winter, while the smell might have been slightly muted by the cold, the underlying problem remained. This raw sewage, flowing into the river from which many still drew their drinking water, was a breeding ground for disease. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, these were not just abstract threats, they were terrifying realities that swept through the city with horrifying regularity, particularly in the colder months when people were already weakened and huddled together for warmth. The connection between contaminated water and disease was only just beginning to be understood by pioneering figures like John Snow, who famously mapped the Broad Street cholera outbreak. But for most of the Victorian era, people simply attributed these devastating epidemics to miasms or bad air, which, to be fair, was also pretty bad. Let's take a moment to consider the sheer physical hardship of daily life for the working poor in such conditions. Imagine being a street sweeper, or a dock worker, or a crossing sweeper, one of those unfortunate souls who cleared paths for pedestrians across muddy, horse manure-filled streets in the depths of winter. They would be outside for hours, exposed to the elements, wearing inadequate clothing, often barely fed. Frostbite was a common, brutal reality. Chilblains, painful red swellings on fingers and toes caused by exposure to cold and damp, were an everyday misery. Children, of course, suffered disproportionately. Many worked in gruelingly cold factories or as chimney sweeps or on the streets selling matches or flowers. Their thin clothing and poor nutrition made them incredibly vulnerable to the cold and the diseases it brought. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, and winter only exacerbated this tragedy. Imagine trying to keep a newborn warm in a drafty, unheated slum dwelling with little food and no access to proper medical care. It was a constant, desperate struggle for survival. And the transportation? Well, if you weren't walking or taking a hansom cab, you were probably on an omnibus. These were often open-topped, exposed to the elements. Imagine sitting on the top deck of an omnibus, exposed to the icy winds and the relentless drizzle as the city slowly crept by, shrouded in a grimy, sooty fog. Not exactly a luxurious commute, is it? The roads themselves were often treacherous, slick with ice, mud, and horse manure, making falls and accidents common. Even something as seemingly simple as getting around could be a challenge. The fog could be so thick that it literally brought the city to a standstill. Businesses would close early, and people would get lost trying to navigate familiar streets. Imagine being disoriented in a dense, smoky fog, unable to see more than a few feet in front of you, with the constant fear of stumbling into the Thames or being hit by an unseen carriage. It adds a certain layer of existential dread to the already grim situation, doesn't it?
Let's float over to another rather unpleasant aspect of Victorian winters, the issue of heating for the extremely poor. For those living in the rookeries and slum tenements, coal was a luxury many couldn't afford. They would burn whatever they could find, scraps of wood, old rags, even rubbish, just to generate a tiny bit of warmth. This, of course, produced even more noxious fumes and greatly increased the risk of devastating fires in already flimsy, overcrowded buildings. A small spark in a cramped wooden tenement could quickly engulf an entire block, leaving hundreds homeless and utterly destitute in the freezing conditions. A truly terrifying prospect, especially with no effective fire brigade to speak of for much of the era. And what about the phenomenon of the frozen Thames? Now, this is something that often captures the imagination, the famous frost fairs. From the 17th century through the early 19th century, before the river was embanked and bridges narrowed its flow, the Thames would occasionally freeze solid enough to hold fairs and markets on its icy surface. People would roast oxen, play games, and generally have a jolly, if somewhat precarious, time. But by the Victorian era, thanks to those embankments and the increasing number of bridges, the Thames rarely froze solid enough for such festivities. However, when it did get truly cold, the river would still become choked with ice floes, making river traffic impossible. This had serious economic repercussions, disrupting trade and leaving many river workers jobless in the depths of winter. So while the romantic image of the frost fair might be appealing, the reality of a freezing Thames for most Victorians was more about economic hardship and logistical nightmares than quaint entertainment. The clothing of the era, while perhaps appearing voluminous and warm in paintings, often wasn't quite up to the task of truly warding off the deep cold and persistent damp. Layers, yes, but often made of wools that, once wet, became heavy and took ages to dry, leading to chills and further vulnerability to illness. For the wealthy, furs and thick cloaks offered some protection, but for the majority, their everyday wear was simply not sufficient for the brutal conditions. Underwear, as we know it, was rudimentary, and thermal fabrics were still centuries away. Imagine trying to stay warm when your clothing is perpetually damp and your shoes let in the icy slush. It's a rather grim mental image, isn't it? And the night. Oh, the Victorian night. In winter, with the early sunsets and the thick fogs, the nights were long, dark, and utterly unforgiving. Street lighting was still evolving, starting with gas lamps that cast pools of flickering yellowish light, but leaving vast swaths of the city in deep shadow. This darkness, combined with the cold and the general air of misery, fostered a sense of unease and, frankly, danger. Crime, always present, seemed to take on a more sinister edge in the dark, cold nights. Footpads and pickpockets thrived in the dim light and the general chaos of the streets. For those without a home or those who worked late into the night, finding shelter from the cold was a constant, desperate battle. Workhouses offered a meager, often brutal refuge, but many preferred to risk exposure rather than face the indignities and harsh conditions within. Imagine trying to sleep on the cold, damp streets with no protection from the wind or the rain or the pervasive cold that seemed to cut right through your bones. The mortality rate among the homeless in winter was predictably horrific. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? Let's gently consider the sheer lack of remedies. If you got sick, particularly with a severe respiratory illness, medical options were incredibly limited. Doctors, if you could even afford one, had very little in the way of effective treatments for pneumonia or severe bronchitis. Rest, warmth, and perhaps some dubious tonics were often the best they could offer. Antibiotics were a distant dream. So a simple winter cold could easily escalate into a life-threatening condition, particularly for the old, the very young, and those already weakened by poverty and malnutrition. It was a time when a cough truly could be a death sentence. And the general grimness extended to the culinary delights of the season. While we might imagine festive roasts and puddings, for the average Londoner, winter meant even more reliance on cheap, starchy, and often nutritionally deficient foods. Potatoes, bread, maybe some cheap cuts of meat if they were lucky, and plenty of gruel. Fresh produce was scarce and expensive, meaning a lack of essential vitamins at a time when they were most needed to fight off illness. Imagine trying to keep your spirits up and your body healthy on such a monotonous and inadequate diet while battling the relentless cold and pollution. It's a truly miserable picture. The psychological impact of these conditions is hard to overstate. The constant grind of fighting against the elements, the pervasive illness, the economic insecurity that worsened in winter, it all created a deeply challenging environment. Hope, for many, was a rare commodity. The promise of spring seemed impossibly far away when you were living day to day in a world of gray skies, biting winds, and lung-clogging smog. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that people not only survived, but often managed to carve out moments of connection and community amidst such adversity. Even simple tasks became Herculean efforts. Washing clothes, for example. Without modern conveniences, this was already a laborious chore. In winter, with freezing water, clothes that took forever to dry, and limited space, it became even greater a burden. Imagine trying to get a family's laundry clean and dry in a cold, damp tenement room with the constant threat of illness looming. It's the kind of practical, everyday misery that often gets overlooked in our romanticized visions of the past. The soundscape of a Victorian winter night in London would have been its own unique, slightly unsettling symphony. The distant clang of an occasional bell, the clatter of a passing hansom cab muffled by the fog, perhaps the faint cries of street vendors trying to sell their wares in the fading light. But mostly, it would have been dominated by the sounds of the wind whistling through gaps in poorly constructed buildings, the constant low hum of a city battling the cold, and the pervasive, unpleasant symphony of coughs and wheezes from a populace struggling to breathe. Not exactly the gentle lullaby we might imagine, is it? So, while we might admire the aesthetic of Victorian London, with its grand architecture and literary associations, it's important to remember that beneath that surface lay a reality of profound hardship, particularly during the brutal winter months. It was a time when the weather wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a fundamental force shaping daily life, dictating health, impacting economics, and constantly testing the limits of human endurance. And as we slowly drift back from this chilly historical excursion, perhaps we can appreciate our modern comforts just a tiny bit more. That central heating, that clean water, that fresh air, they really were hard-won victories, weren't they?
The indoor chill and the great smog. So we've talked about the streets, the freezing river, and the general misery of being outside in a Victorian winter. But you might be thinking, surely if you just stayed inside, nestled by a hearth with a glass of sherry, it wasn't that bad. Well, let's just gently disabuse ourselves of that notion. Because unless you were the Duke of somewhere important living in a literal palace, staying warm indoors was a full-time, soul-crushing job. Let's start with the hearth itself. In a typical middle-class Victorian home, the fireplace was the absolute center of the universe. If you weren't within a 6-foot radius of those coals, you were essentially living in a refrigerator. Because of how houses were built, with high ceilings and absolutely zero insulation, all that lovely warmth did exactly what physics demands. It went straight up the chimney. To keep a single room even vaguely habitable, you had to burn through an ungodly amount of coal. And someone had to carry that coal. Usually a servant, or if you were less well off, the mother of the house, lugging heavy buckets up narrow, winding stairs in the dark. It was back-breaking work just to keep the temperature above freezing. And the soot. Oh, the soot was everywhere. It settled on the curtains, it stained the wallpaper, and it lived in your lungs. Victorians were obsessed with heavy, dark velvet draperies and thick carpets, not just because they liked the aesthetic, but because they were desperate to stop the drafts. Every window was a source of a biting, icy breeze. People would stuff old rags into the cracks of the window frames and place long, sausage-like draft excluders at the base of every door. It was a constant battle of man versus physics, and physics was usually winning. The midnight freeze. Now imagine going to bed. This wasn't the cozy experience we know today. You'd leave the one warm room in the house and trek through a hallway that was effectively the same temperature as the Arctic Circle. You'd climb into a bed that felt like it was made of ice. To combat this, you'd wear layers, flannel nightgowns, nightcaps because losing heat through your head was a genuine concern, and maybe even a pair of thick wool socks. If you were lucky, you had a copper warming pan. A servant would fill it with hot coals and slide it between your sheets for a few minutes before you got in. It didn't actually keep you warm all night, it just took the "I might actually die" edge off the initial contact with the linens. By 3 a.m., the coals in the parlor had died down, the warming pan was cold, and you were left shivering under 4 layers of heavy wool blankets that felt like they weighed 50 pounds. It was less like sleeping and more like being buried alive in cold fabric. And then there was the hygiene, or rather the lack of it. Taking a bath in winter was a logistical nightmare.
You had to heat every single gallon of water on the stove, carry it to a tin tub in front of the fire, and wash quickly before the water turned into an ice bath. Most people just didn't. They'd do a sponge wash of the bits that smelled the worst and call it a day. This meant that by mid-January, the average Victorian household smelled like a combination of damp wool, coal smoke, and unwashed humanity. But we really need to talk about the London particulars again, because they were the true villains of the season. These weren't your garden variety fogs, they were chemical events. Because everyone was burning low-quality soft coal, the air was thick with sulfur dioxide. When this mixed with the natural moisture of the Thames, it created a yellowish-black acidic mist. It was thick enough that people would literally walk off the edge of the docks and drown in the river because they couldn't see the ground beneath their feet. There are accounts of people following the taillights of a carriage, thinking it was heading toward a main road, only to find they'd followed a random wagon into a dead-end alleyway miles from home. Blind people were actually hired as guides during these fogs because they were the only ones who knew the city by touch and sound well enough to navigate the total darkness. If you were a royal, you might think you were safe, but the smog didn't care about your bloodline. Queen Victoria's own husband, Prince Albert, famously complained about the black slime that coated everything in London. It didn't matter how many servants you had scrubbing the walls, the winter air would eventually turn your white marble statues a dull, gritty gray. It was a great leveler in the most depressing way possible. The tragedy of the London death rate. Every time a major fog rolled in, the death rate in London spiked. It wasn't a mystery, it was predictable. The hospitals would fill up with people whose lungs simply gave out. They called it fog fever, but it was essentially mass choking. In a particularly bad week in 1973, the fog was so dense that it killed over 700 people, and quite bizarrely, a large number of prize cattle at a livestock show in Islington. The cows literally suffocated where they stood. For the poor living in East End slums like Whitechapel, winter was a death sentence. In overcrowded tenements, 10 people might huddle together in a single room, sharing a tiny bit of warmth and inevitably sharing their germs. If one person caught the winter cough, everyone had it by Tuesday. And since they couldn't afford a doctor, they'd turn to patent medicines, which were usually just a mix of alcohol and opium. It didn't cure the pneumonia, but it made you care a lot less about the fact that you were freezing to death. The quiet gray end. As the winter dragged on into February, the city became a landscape of slush. The snow would fall, look pretty for about 5 minutes, and then immediately turn into a disgusting brown paste as it mixed with horse manure and coal dust. This London mud was a legendary substance, a sticky, freezing slurry that ruined shoes and soaked into the hems of long Victorian skirts. Women would have to hold their heavy skirts up while navigating the streets, trying not to trip on the ice or sink into the filth. It was a constant battle of man versus physics, and physics was usually winning. So, as you lay there in your room with your consistent temperature, your breathable air, and your lack of black slime on the walls, just take a moment to be glad you aren't a Victorian street sweeper, because their winters weren't just brutal, they were a slow-motion disaster that lasted 4 months every single year.
The festive fiascos and dangerous decorations. So we've survived the frozen bedrooms and the black slime of the London fog, but now let's gently drift toward the part of winter that was supposed to be joyful, Christmas. We often think of the Victorian Christmas as this golden age of cozy traditions, thanks largely to Charles Dickens and Prince Albert. But in reality, the Victorian attempt at holiday cheer was often just a series of high-stakes gambles with fire, poison, and questionable poultry. You see, the Victorians didn't do things by halves. If they were going to celebrate, they were going to do it with an intensity that was frankly a little alarming. Let's start with the centerpiece of the season, the Christmas tree. Before Prince Albert popularized the German tradition in the 1840s, the tree wasn't really a thing in England. But once the royal family did it, everyone, and I mean everyone, had to have one. The problem, they didn't have LED lights. They used actual flickering wax candles. Now imagine a city where every parlor is stuffed with heavy, flammable velvet curtains, thick carpets, and a dried-out evergreen tree covered in open flames. It's essentially a giant tinderbox. It was a common holiday tradition for the father of the house to stand by the tree with a bucket of water or a wet sponge on a stick, just waiting for the inevitable moment a branch caught fire. Nothing says Merry Christmas quite like a low-level state of panic while opening your presents. Then there was the food. If you were a member of the upper crust, your Christmas dinner was an exercise in gluttony. We're talking about multiple courses of heavy meats, suet puddings, and jellied everything. But for the middle and lower classes, the Christmas goose was the ultimate goal. However, getting a goose in a city of millions without refrigeration was a bit of a trick. Many people belonged to goose clubs, where they'd pay a few pennies a week all year just to secure a bird for December. But since there was no way to keep the meat fresh, the local bakers would often stay open on Christmas morning to cook everyone's birds in their massive ovens. You'd see hundreds of people walking through the freezing, foggy streets, carrying raw poultry to the baker, and then carrying it back home, dripping hot grease onto the icy cobblestones. It was a logistical nightmare, and if the bird was a little off by the time it hit the table, well, that was just part of the Victorian winter experience. A side of salmonella with your plum pudding? Because why not? Speaking of plum pudding, or figgy pudding, this wasn't the light, airy dessert we might enjoy today. It was a dense bowling ball of suet, dried fruit, and enough brandy to preserve a mummy. The tradition was to hide a silver coin inside. While this sounds charming, it was essentially a tooth-breaking hazard. Imagine a soot-covered Victorian child biting down with all their might on a hunk of suet hidden in a silver shilling. It's a miracle anyone had teeth left by New Year's Day. The snapdragon madness. But if the tree candles and the suspect goose weren't enough, the Victorians had a parlor game that was legitimately unhinged. It was called Snapdragon. Here's the premise. You take a large, shallow bowl, fill it with raisins, and then douse those raisins in brandy. You dim the lights until the room is eerie and gray, and then you set the brandy on fire. The goal was to reach your hand into the blue flames, grab a burning raisin, and eat it while it was still alight. Yes, really. This was considered a fun, family-friendly activity. The sight of your relatives' faces glowing in the flickering blue light of a literal fire pit while they hissed and snatched at burning fruit was supposed to be festive. In reality, it mostly resulted in singed eyebrows and minor facial burns. It's the kind of thing that makes you realize the Victorians were just built different, or perhaps they were just so bored and cold that a little light arson seemed like a reasonable way to spend an evening. The toxic trinkets. And we can't forget the gifts. The Victorians loved a good DIY project, but their materials were questionable. They loved bright colors, especially a very specific shade of vibrant green, known as Shields green. It was beautiful, it was festive, and it was made with staggering amounts of arsenic. It was in the wallpaper, it was in the dresses, and yes, it was even used to dye the faux leaves on Christmas wreaths and some children's toys. People would hang these beautiful green decorations in their small, unventilated, overheated rooms, and the heat from the gas lamps would cause the arsenic to flake off or turn into a toxic gas. So while the family was huddled together for warmth, they were also gently inhaling poison. It gives a new meaning to the phrase sickly sweet holiday. The New Year's hangover. By the time New Year's Eve rolled around, the glamour of the holidays had usually worn off, leaving behind a city that was even darker and grittier than before. The New Year wasn't celebrated with massive fireworks displays. It was more about first footing, the tradition that the first person to cross your threshold after midnight would determine your luck for the year. Ideally, this person should be a tall, dark-haired male carrying a piece of coal. In the middle of a London winter, finding a tall, dark-haired man who wasn't already covered in coal dust was probably the hardest part of the tradition. People would wait in the freezing dark for their lucky visitor, hoping for a sign that the next 12 months would be slightly less miserable than the last. As the festivities faded, the reality of deep winter set in, the long slog through January and February that we discussed earlier. The decorations would be taken down, hopefully without burning the house down. The arsenic green wreaths would be tossed out, and the city would return to its status as a gray, shivering, coal-smelling giant. The Victorian winter was a season of extremes: extreme cold, extreme grime, and extreme, often dangerous, attempts to find a bit of light in the darkness. It was a time when even a celebration felt like a survival atoll. And as we leave the flickering blue flames of the Snapdragon Bowl behind, we can take a deep breath of our non-arsenic-filled air and be grateful for the boring, safe, electric-lit winters of the present.
The Great Freeze of 1895 and the Final Chill. So, we've navigated the soot-stained parlors and survived the flaming raisins of the Victorian Christmas. But now, I want us to drift into the deepest, darkest, and most famously frigid moment of the entire era. If you think a standard Victorian winter was bad, we have to talk about the year 1895. This was the winter that didn't just bite, it swallowed the city whole. It was a time when the London particular fog wasn't just a nuisance, it became a tombstone. In early 1895, a massive high-pressure system sat over the British Isles and simply refused to budge. For nearly 2 months, the temperature plummeted and stayed there. This wasn't a flurry of snow type of situation. This was a deep Siberian freeze that turned the capital of the world's greatest empire into a frozen wasteland. Let's just settle back and imagine the sheer, quiet horror of a city that was literally freezing to its very core. The river turns to stone. The most iconic image of this winter was the River Thames. As we mentioned earlier, the river rarely froze solid in the Victorian age because of the way the new embankments sped up the current. But 1895 was different. The cold was so intense and so prolonged that the great river began to slow down. Huge chunks of ice, some the size of small houses, began to swirl and collide near the bridges. Eventually, they jammed together, and the river, the very lifeblood of London, stopped moving. People actually walked across it. Near Westminster and Blackfriars, adventurous, or perhaps just bored, Londoners ventured out onto the ice. It wasn't the festive frost fair of the 1600s. It was a grim, silent landscape of jagged white peaks and gray sludge. The ships were trapped. Thousands of men who made their living on the docks were suddenly out of work, with zero savings and no way to heat their homes. The economic paralysis was as cold as the ice itself. Imagine standing on London Bridge in February 1895. The air is so cold it feels like needles in your nostrils. There is no sound of rushing water, just the eerie creaking of the ice and the distant hacking coughs of the city. The sun is a pale, useless coin in a sky choked with yellow smog. It's a scene of absolute desolation, and yet life, of a sort, had to go on. The bursting of the veins. While the river was freezing, something much more practical and terrifying was happening underground: the water mains. Victorian engineering was impressive, but it hadn't prepared for a freeze this deep. The earth froze several feet down, and the iron pipes began to snap like glass. Suddenly, whole neighborhoods had no water. And I don't just mean no hot water, I mean nothing. If you wanted a drink or a way to boil a potato, you had to go out into the street with a pickaxe and a bucket, find a frozen standpipe, and hope a neighbor had started a small fire nearby to melt the ice. This led to water riots in some of the poorer districts. People were fighting over frozen puddles.
And because the water pipes were bursting, the sewage pipes were often doing the same. The black slime we talked about earlier, it was now frozen into the streets. The city became a giant, icy, unsanitary mess. Imagine the smell when the sun finally did come out for an hour, a mixture of frozen waste and coal smoke. It's enough to make you want to pull your covers up a little higher, isn't it? The architecture of misery. In the slums of the East End, the 1895 freeze was a massacre. The walls of the tenements were often only 1 brick thick. They offered no protection. Moisture from the breath of the 10 people huddled in one room would freeze on the inside of the windows, forming thick sheets of ice that blocked out what little light there was. People burned their furniture, first the chairs, then the tables, then the floorboards. When those were gone, they huddled together in a pile of rags, trying to share body heat. The overhead relief committees tried to help, handing out soup and bread, but the sheer scale of the misery was overwhelming. This was the winter that broke the myth of Victorian progress. All the steam engines and factories in the world couldn't stop a child from freezing to death in a cellar in Spitalfields. Even the animals suffered. Horses, the primary mode of transport, couldn't find traction on the ice. They would slip, break their legs, and be shot where they fell. The streets were littered with the frozen carcasses of horses, half buried in the soot-covered snow. It was a brutal, Darwinian landscape where only the luckiest survived. The quiet return of spring. When the thaw finally came in March, it wasn't a gentle awakening. It was a disaster of its own right. All that frozen pipes suddenly thawed at once, flooding thousands of homes. The river ice broke up with the sound of cannon fire, smashing into piers and boats. The Great Thaw of 1895 was almost as destructive as the freeze itself. But as the ice melted and the first weak rays of spring sun hit the soot-stained streets, Londoners did what they always did. They carried on. They scrubbed the grime off their doorsteps, they buried their dead, and they waited for the next winter, hoping it wouldn't be quite so particular. Final thoughts for a restful night. The Victorian winter was a time of unimaginable grit. It was a world of shadows, of biting cold, and of a relentless struggle for a tiny bit of warmth. But there's a strange, quiet beauty in the way they endured it. They found joy in a single orange at Christmas. They found community in a shared fire. They found a way to navigate the darkness even when they couldn't see their own hands. As we end our journey tonight, let the image of those flickering gas lamps fade away. Feel the warmth of your own room, the softness of your own sheets, and the clean, easy air you're breathing right now. The London particular is gone. The Thames is flowing freely, and the coal smoke has cleared. You are safe, you are warm, and the winter of 1895 is just a story in the dark. Close your eyes now. The clatter of the hansom cabs has faded away. The city is silent. The ice has melted. Sleep well, knowing that the brutal Victorian winter is long, long ago.
So, we have witnessed the river turn to stone and the city buckle under the weight of 1895. But as we move toward the conclusion of our long, cold journey through the Victorian winter, I want us to linger in that strange, liminal space, the end of the season. This is the part of the winter that rarely makes it into the storybooks. It's the period when the adrenaline of the holidays has vanished, the great freeze has peaked, and the city is left in a state of exhausted, gray suspension. Let's sink deeper into our pillows and imagine London in the late winter, late February and early March. The world is no longer white. It is a bruised purple and a heavy, oily charcoal. This was the time of the long wait, where the endurance of the Victorian Londoner was tested to its absolute breaking point. The architecture of the damp. By this point in the season, the cold had moved beyond the air and had settled permanently into the masonry. Victorian houses were built of porous brick, and after months of sleet and fog, the walls themselves became saturated. If you were to touch the wallpaper in a middle-class drawing room in March, it would feel clammy and limp. In the poorer districts, the walls literally wept. A thin film of moisture would grow a delicate, fuzzy coat of black mold, a winter garden that no one wanted. This dampness was a silent thief. It stole the heat from the fires faster than the coal could provide it. It rotted the floorboards under the heavy carpets. It made the air inside the homes feel heavier and harder to breathe than the air outside. People lived in a perpetual chill, a feeling that no amount of tea or wool could truly erase. Imagine the sensation of your clothes never being quite dry, of your bedsheets feeling like cold, damp seaweed against your skin. This was the subtle, grinding reality of the Victorian domestic experience. And for the elite, even they weren't spared. The grandest mansions in Belgravia suffered from rising damp. The servants would spend their mornings scrubbing saltpeter, a white, crusty mineral deposit, off the basement walls. It didn't matter if you were a coal heaver or a count. The London winter was an invasive force that respected no social boundaries. It was a slow, wet siege. The specter of the White Plague. As the winter dragged on, the physical toll became visible on every street corner. This was the season of the hollow cheek. The lack of sunlight, sometimes London wouldn't see a clear blue sky for 40 days straight, meant that vitamin D deficiency or rickets was rampant among children. Their bones would soften, their legs would bow, and their growth would stunt. In the dim light of a March afternoon, the children of the London slums looked like small, fragile ghosts, their skin a translucent, waxy yellow. Then there was tuberculosis, the White Plague. It was the ultimate winter predator. It loved the damp walls, the unventilated rooms, and the weakened lungs of a populace that had been inhaling coal dust since November. A Victorian winter didn't just end with the arrival of spring, it ended with a surge in funeral processions. The sound of a heavy, wet cough in a crowded omnibus wasn't just an annoyance, it was a sound that made people move away in silent, superstitious fear. Let's float for a moment past the windows of a local infirmary. The wards are overflowing. There are no antibiotics, no high-tech respirators, just rows of iron cots, the smell of carbolic acid, and the tireless, exhausted nurses moving through the shadows like moths. It was a quiet, somber battlefield where the only weapon was patience and a bit of beef broth. Outside, the streets were undergoing a transformation that was more disgusting than the freeze itself. As the temperature hovered just above freezing, the London mud returned with a vengeance. This wasn't just dirt, it was a complex geological layer of pulverized stone, horse urine, soot, and the organic remains of a city of 4 million people. The crossing sweepers, mostly young boys or elderly men in rags, would work feverishly to clear a tiny path through this knee-deep slurry so that a lady in a silk dress could cross the street without ruining her life. They lived on the pennies thrown to them by the wealthy, standing for 10 hours a day in the freezing slush. When we think of brutal, we must think of their feet. Most wore boots with holes in the soles, stuffed with newspaper that quickly turned into a cold, pulpy mess. And yet there was a strange rhythmic beauty to the city's movement. The clop-clop of the horses, the muffled cries of the muffin man or the lavender seller, all dampened by the thick, moist air. The city was like a giant, wounded animal, slowly shaking off the ice and preparing to breathe again. The final embers. As we reach the end of our monologue, let's imagine the very last fire of the season. It's a small fire, perhaps just a few coals left in the grate. The sun is setting later now, a pale, watery orange light reflecting off the ripples of the Thames. The ice has finally vanished into the sea. The Victorian Londoner would look out their window at the budding trees in the park, trees that were still coated in a layer of soot, but trees that were undeniably alive. They had survived another one. They had navigated the particulars, outlasted the great freeze, and endured the long, damp nights of the White Plague. There is a profound, sleepy peace in the end of such a struggle. The tension leaves the shoulders. The breath becomes a little easier as the coal smoke thins. The heavy wool coats are brushed one last time and put away into cedar chests with a sigh of genuine relief. Closing the ledger. The Victorian winter was a teacher of many things. It taught the value of a warm hearth, the fragility of human health, and the sheer, stubborn resilience of the human heart. It was a time of darkness, yes, but that darkness made the smallest light, a candle, a smile, a hot potato, seem like a miracle. As you drift off tonight, let the cold streets of 1895 dissolve. You are not standing in the slush of Whitechapel or shivering in a drafty bedroom in Kensington. You are here in the warmth of the 21st century. The air is clean, the water is liquid, the walls are dry. The long, gray monologue of the Victorian winter has come to its final sentence. The hansom cabs have all gone to sleep. The street lamps have been extinguished. The city of the past is silent now, tucked away in the dusty pages of history. Sleep now. The spring is coming. The fog has lifted, and you are perfectly, wonderfully safe.
The shadows of the workhouse and the silent slumber of the city. We have watched the ice break on the Thames, and we have felt the damp seep into the very bones of the London brickwork. But before we let the sun finally rise on our Victorian winter, we must drift into the deepest shadow of all, the places where the brutality of the season wasn't just a physical chill, but a social one. As we settle in for this final stretch of our journey, let's wrap our blankets tighter and float toward the towering, grim silhouettes of the Victorian workhouses and the silent, forgotten corners of the city's edge. In the 19th century, if you were truly defeated by the winter, if the coal ran out, the bread disappeared, and the frostbite took your ability to work, you ended up at the gates of the Union Workhouse. These were the bastilles of the poor, designed specifically to be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would enter. But in the dead of winter, unpleasant was a luxury compared to freezing to death on a doorstep in Cheapside. The architecture of despair. Imagine walking through those heavy oak doors as a freezing sleet falls outside. The first thing that hits you isn't the warmth, because the workhouses were notoriously drafty, but the smell. It was a suffocating mix of carbolic soap, boiled cabbage, and the damp, sour scent of hundreds of unwashed bodies huddled together. The Victorian authorities believed that poverty was a moral failing, so even in the depths of a brutal winter, they made sure you earned your stay. Men were often tasked with oakum picking, the soul-crushing job of unraveling old tarred ropes with your bare, frozen fingers until your nails bled. Imagine doing that in a room where the only heat came from a single pathetic stove in the center of a vast hall. Your fingers would be so numb they felt like wooden pegs, yet you had to keep picking, hour after hour, while the gray winter light faded outside the barred windows. The women's wards were no better. They spent their winters scrubbing endless floors with freezing water or sewing coarse uniforms in near darkness to save on the cost of gaslight. There was no festive cheer here, no snapdragon games or silver shillings in the pudding. Christmas dinner in a workhouse was often just an extra ounce of meat or a slightly thicker piece of bread. It was a winter of the spirit, a long, monotonous stretch of survival, where the goal wasn't to thrive, but simply to see the next morning. The Midnight Watchman and the Four-Penny Lean. Let's float back out into the night, away from the workhouse walls and toward the doss houses of the East End. For those who couldn't or wouldn't enter the workhouse, there were even stranger ways to survive a London winter night. Have you ever heard of the Four-Penny Lean? For 4 pennies, a homeless person could get a bed in a crowded, filthy room. But if you only had 2 pennies, you paid for the rope. Imagine a long room with a rope stretched from one wall to the other. You would sit on a bench and lean your upper body over the rope, dangling there like laundry, just to keep yourself from slumped onto the freezing floor. A watchman would stand at the end of the room, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, he would simply untie the rope. Everyone would fall to the floor, woken by the sudden impact, and be turned out into the freezing pre-dawn fog to begin another day of shivering. It sounds like a nightmare, doesn't it? But to a Victorian Londoner in February, that rope represented safety. It was a way to stay upright, to keep the blood moving, and to stay off the streets where the black frost could claim you in your sleep. It's these tiny, bizarre details of survival that truly illustrate how brutal the season was. Life was measured in pennies and inches of rope. Now, let's move toward the outskirts of the city, to the great magnificent 7 cemeteries, like Highgate or Kensal Green. In winter, these places became cities of their own, cities of stone and silence. The Victorian obsession with death reached its peak in the winter months, for obvious reasons. If you were a wealthy Victorian family, a winter funeral was an elaborate theatrical affair. Imagine the mutes, professional mourners dressed in deep black, wearing top hats draped in long silk weepers, standing outside the house of the deceased in a dead blizzard. The hearses were pulled by black horses wearing towering plumes of ostrich feathers. Imagine the sight of that dark procession moving through the white snow and yellow fog. The only sound was the crunch of the wheels on the ice and the rhythmic tolling of a distant church bell. It was beautiful in a haunting, miserable sort of way, but beneath the pageantry was the grim reality. The ground was often so frozen that gravediggers had to light fires on the earth just to soften it enough to dig. Even in death, the Victorian winter demanded one last struggle. But as our long monologue reaches its conclusion, the sun is finally beginning to do something it hasn't done in weeks. It is rising with a bit of actual strength. The year is turning. The particulars are thinning out, revealing the red brick chimneys and the steeples of Christopher Wren's churches. The Victorian era's winter wasn't just a season, it was an adversary. It was a character in every person's life story, a ghost that sat at every table. It shaped the way they built their homes, the way they treated the poor, and the way they cherished the sun. As we leave these foggy streets behind, take a deep, clear breath. There is no soot in your throat. There is no frost on your blankets. The Four-Penny Lean is a ghost of the past, and the workhouse gates have long since rusted shut. The Victorian Londoners are all asleep now, resting under their stone monuments in Highgate, safe from the damp and the cold. And you, too, can rest. The city is quiet. The gas lamps have flickered out for the last time. The long, brutal winter is over, and the morning, our modern, warm morning, is just a few hours away. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the hansom cabs fade into the distance. Let the image of the frozen Thames dissolve into a warm, gentle mist. You have traveled through the smoke, the ice, and the shadows, and you have come out the other side. Sleep now, deep, peaceful, and warm. The story is finished. The history is still. Sleep.